Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to get started, so if you want to find a seat. We have a complicated setup today, but thank you. Jean has worked his magic, so I think everything should work out fine. My name is Peter Dickinson. I teach in the School for the Contemporary Arts here at SFU, and I also am the director of the Institute for Performance Studies.
Hello. My name is Dara Culhane, and I teach anthropology here at SFU, and I work with Peter and the Institute for Performance Studies, and I also work with the Center for Imaginative Ethnography, which partners often with Institute for Performance Studies. Thank you.
So before we begin, we would just like to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including lands belonging to the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. At last year's closing Critical Ideas panel, the Aboriginal artist Fred Leone, touring to PuSh with Black Armband's Dirt Song, talked about why, in the context of settler colonial societies like Australia and Canada, it is important for such acknowledgements to become habit, but not to become habitual.
So, in that spirit, we as settler scholars wish to acknowledge that the struggle for Indigenous territorial sovereignty and resource rights is ongoing. It is not something that happened in the past and is now over. And in particular, right here and right now, we want to draw your attention to the fact that there are 3 commercial salmon farms located in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, Kwakwaka'wakw Nation waters. Then they're located in what is now named the Broughton Archipelago, which is northern Vancouver Island. These are currently being occupied by Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists who are demanding that the fish farms close. This is a struggle that's been going on for 30 years, but has reached such a critical point that the very strong position being taken now is that the fish farms must close, period. There have been injunctions served on some of the occupiers, and if you tune into the news today, you will see that 2 women who have been living in tents outside the Department of Fisheries and Oceans office in Victoria, and also outside the Premier John Horgan's office in Langford, were arrested yesterday because they refused to leave. They said they had a right to be there based on their Indigenous rights and having obtained proper permission from the Indigenous owners of the territory. They were arrested. They refused to sign anything saying that they would not go back and they would not take up the matriarch camp again. So they were released yesterday. They went back today. They were rearrested today. So please try to keep track of what's going on, because there will be a series of injunctions now and court cases that will follow those injunctions. Okay, so we're going to share with you now a 3-minute video that some of the people who are occupying have made to explain why they're taking this position and what the issues are around commercial salmon farms. And you'll see here just information about websites and where you can find more information, and also where you can find out how you can offer support if you want to. Thank you.
Command what, John?
That was my first impression. My first feeling was that of strength. I felt really powerful going and with a mandate and a responsibility to report and show these images to people, my families, that these fish are really sick. These fish are polluting the environment that we call home. The images that came out of that farm are horrifying. These fish that are being harvested out of the Nula and Wakwa fish pens are going straight to market. These fish are being cut out. The really gross parts are being cut off in these plants, and they're being wrapped in plastic, and they're being sold to the public. But more shocking is that whatever's killing these fish is just sort of pouring into our environment and pouring into the strait, and there's no controlling it. After I got off the Nula farm, I snuck off to the bow of the Martin Sheen, and luckily nobody was around. And I stared up at the cliffs and I just cried. I had this incredible sadness. I couldn't keep it in anymore. I lost it and I cried. I normally don't get like that, but there was something really, really wrong with that whole scene. I was thinking about my grandparents, and I was thinking about my grandchildren. Kind of all just fell on me just then. I can't get over the fact that they might win if we don't do something. It really scared me that this has been allowed. They've allowed this to happen. If we don't act now, we're going to miss this opportunity, this little window of opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past. You know, when I think about our people's history, and I think about the colonialization, the stripping of our rights, the stripping of our identity, the fact that our language is disappearing, the potlatch ban, the fish is all we have left, and they can't take our fish. We don't exist here without our fish.
So thank you very much for allowing us to share that with you. I'm not sure, Shannon, if you're with us, but you can call up your camera at any moment. Oh, there she is. Yay! Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the third year that the Institute for Performance Studies has partnered with the PuSh Festival to broaden the critical discourse around performance, around the presentation of performance, around topics that and content in performance. And we're very pleased to continue this partnership. And we thank the School for the Contemporary Arts and also SFU Woodward's cultural programs for invaluable support, including invaluable technical support. We always try, Joyce, Director of Programming, who's here with us today from PuSh, we have a meeting, actually we'll have a meeting shortly after the end of this festival about thinking about next year. And we brainstorm ideas about what might be interesting and topics to discuss. And we try to relate that as much as possible to the programming during the festival. So among other things, Patrick Keating, who's with us today, and Shannon, who's up on the screen before you, their works triggered a conversation around theater and institutional spaces. And so we thought that might be an interesting dialogue to have around theater that gets produced in institutional spaces, including prisons, including care facilities, including for corporate events and things like that, but also the way in which experiences within institutional spaces, including education facilities such as this one, might inform the content and presentation of performance. So Before I introduce today's esteemed panelists, I just want to remind people that there are two more of these dialogues. The next one on object-oriented performances occurs a week from today in this very room at the same time, and we have a wonderful lineup of panelists there, including Anthony Hamilton, who is presenting his work Meeting at this year's festival. And then finally we'll end, my colleague Dara, whom you just met, will chair the following Friday in the morning at 10:30, from 10:30 to noon, a final in the cinema, this time upstairs, a final panel on contemporary Indigenous women's performance, again featuring many artists in the lineup, including Dana Ashby and Chris Dirksen, among others. So it gives me great pleasure, you don't want to hear me talking very much longer, to introduce our panelists. On my far right, we have Kathleen Greenfield, who is dedicated to collaborative creation, the development of new work, and community building. She is interested in site-specific outdoor performance, puppetry, retelling old stories. She has a BFA from theater at the University of Victoria, and in 2013 she joined SNAFU Dance Theatre as co-artistic director and has directed many premiere productions for the company. She also teaches play building to kids ranging from 3 to 13 at SCAM School for the Performing Arts. And in 2013, Kathleen joined the artistic team at William Head Prison as a facilitator, workshop leader, assistant director, projection designer, writer, and performer on several of their productions. In 2016, she directed and devised Sleeping Giants with the men at William Head on stage, and she continues to trudge out to William Head at least once a week as a volunteer advisor to the board and as a workshop facilitator and member of book clubs for inmates. Next to Kathleen is Patrick Keating. I'm sure many of you know him as a performer in the city. He's also a writer, originally from Montreal, and his first play, Inside Out, a New World production in collaboration with Main Street Theatre and Urban Crawl, is being presented at this year's PuSh Festival in association with Touchstone, and runs for 3 more performances this evening through Sunday at Performance Works on Granville. It's a wonderful show. I really encourage you to check that out. The play is based on Patrick's 10 years spent in and out of the Canadian penitentiary system, and it was there, while incarcerated, at Askew Prison here in BC, in fact, that Patrick came to theatre, including through a university program, which no longer exists. And since then, he's become a professional theatre artist. He has numerous credits, too many for me to list, but I'll just let you know that you can check him out on Netflix. In 1922. He's also going to be in the upcoming season of X-Files as a Vietnam vet named Trigger, and apparently as a creepy janitor on the new series Life Sentence. Gina Stockdale, trained as to my immediate right, trained as an English and drama teacher at Brentwood College of Education in England, serving as a classroom teacher in England and then Montreal for several years. She also founded and ran a community theatre company for children and featuring children, which used audience participation in its creative process. Following her graduation from SFU in 1985, and I'm proud that we have 2 SFU theatre alums with us on this panel, with a double major in theatre and English, Gina began directing plays, teaching acting in classes at Askew and Kent prisons, while also maintaining an active professional career in theatre, television, and film. Some of you might remember her acclaimed turn as Mother Courage in Ruby Slipper's Public Dreams outdoor production of the play by Brecht. After that, she founded These Four Walls Theatres, which is dedicated to performing in private houses and non-traditional spaces. And finally, up on the screen before you is Shannon Yee, who is an award-winning playwright and producer based in Northern Ireland. Her perspectives as an immigrant, ethnic minority, queer artist with a disability living in Northern Ireland are deeply embedded in her work. And Reassembled, Slightly Askew, which continues at the festival this year at the Cultural Lab at Van City Cultural Unit through February 4th. It is extremely limited capacity, only 8 people per show, so if there are still tickets, you should get them now. It's an audio-based theatre performance that immerses audiences in her first-hand experience of nearly dying and her subsequent acquired brain injury. Reassembled has received numerous accolades and has been touring the UK, Ireland, USA, and Canada since its 2015 premiere. And we're going to start off with Shannon. Each panelist is going to speak for approximately 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have an open conversation. So Jean has worked his magic. She can hear us. You should be able to hear her, and she's going to cue me to advance her slides. So take it away, Shannon.
Here we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much again for having me to be part of this fantastic panel. As Peter said, my show, Reassembled, slightly skews what I'm here to speak with you about. It's about how I nearly died in December 2008 of a rare brain infection and my subsequent journey of rehabilitation with an acquired brain injury. So a lot of people, rightfully so, hear that and say, why would you bother making a show like that, first of all? And second of all, why would I want to go and see it? But when it comes to what the topic that the panel is discussing today, I think it's fairly relevant. So when I woke up in the acute neurosurgical ward at the Royal in Belfast, I'd actually never been in hospital before. I don't remember very much of that experience except thinking to myself, looking around the space. I was essentially lying next to 5 strangers. I had been paralyzed down the left side of my body. I had a hole in my skull about the size of my hand. And I remember looking around the space and going, this would make a crazy Fringe show. You know, in theater, we're all
Are you still with us, Shannon?
I am, yes. I think I froze, though, briefly.
Yeah, we're good now, though.
Okay, right. Great. Fingers crossed. So, I mean, in the arts, we're always trying to transport our audiences, aren't we? And to connect them into some sort of heart, some sort of empathy from which we build connection and new experiences. So when I woke up transported in a completely new world, I knew that I would always create something. The world had changed to understand it. Next slide, Peter, please.
Okay.
Great. So when I became well enough in 2010, not cured, I assembled an interdisciplinary team of 4 other artists, a director, a dramaturg, a choreographer, and a sonic artist. And we then embarked on this process of figuring out exactly how on earth are we going to capture what my experience had been in a new and exciting way that primarily incorporated the elements of movement, because I was really struck by the fact that for 3 weeks I could walk and I have to learn how to walk again. And also sound, because my noise sensitivity is a key aspect of my acquired brain injury. So we ended up using binaural microphone technology, which spatializes sound and makes sound 3-dimensional around the listener's head, and also creates visceral reactions in the listener's body, so that you feel that you're inside my head, going through my experiences of noise sensitivity, of brain surgery, of having to learn how to walk again, the confusion, the anxiety. And it was a new kind of storytelling because we weren't sure how these forms were going to work together, how you work with movement and sound, dramatic narrative around a medical story. So it took about 5 years for us to figure out a new artistic language to create this, but we did. The next slide, please, Peter.
Okay.
So I was able to fundraise across the 5 years, securing ultimately Wellcome Trust funding, which allowed me to bring on board my neurosurgeon, my neuropsychologist, and my head injury nurse onto the team. So they advised on the medical content and also provided their unique perspectives. Also within those 5 years, we test out different drafts with different focus groups of medical professionals, general public, brain injury support organization staff, and families and friends of people with acquired brain injury. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So I have to say, when we started creating the piece, there weren't any stories and theater pieces immersing audiences with binaural microphone technology, but it's become more and more popular now. But I have to say, what makes Reassembled strong, I believe, is that it's an effective marriage of form and content. So the format of binaural microphone technology is that you transport listeners inside my head. They feel they're inside my head. To therefore experience a story of what it was like to have the inside of my head change. So audiences are taken through 9 weeks of my experience as an inpatient in an acute neurosurgical ward, brain surgeries, my discharge into the community, and the early days of discovering what exactly my acquired brain injury was like. So it's an intimate piece, it's an intense piece, and it's also an individual piece. Next slide, please.
Yep.
And this is some of the feedback that we've been very lucky to receive. It has been on tour since 2015, and I have to say I am so thrilled that it's going to finish its 3-year touring here there with you guys at PuSh. So audiences have said also it's affirmed their humanity. It's helped them understand a loved one's experience. And it's the first time, perhaps, that someone has reflected back what they have experienced, and that's from people who've experienced acquired brain injury. So how have medical institutions been affected by this piece? Next slide, please.
Yep.
So as I mentioned, my neurosurgeon, my neuropsychologist, and head injury nurse advised the artistic team on medical accuracy, and they also provided access to institutions that enabled me to bring Reassembled as training in some instances and or sampling it at conferences, which is what this photo shows you. So this is a photograph from the Society of British Neurosurgeons annual conference in 2015. And I have to say, neurosurgeons in their own environment are this fascinating species to watch. It's like this David Attenborough-esque kind of view into how they operate with each other. And I guess what happens at these conferences is that newly qualified neurosurgeons basically go around and look for work. They meet other neurosurgeons that are running different hospitals. And on the left, the gentleman on the left side of the picture, he is the head of the hospital in Manchester, England, and a good friend of my neurosurgeon. And he basically said to one of these kind of qualifying young neurosurgeons that came and experienced the show, sample a few, in the afternoon session. He said to him, look, I would really like to give you a job in my hospital, but I will not do that unless you lie down in that bed and experience the 10-minute sample of what the show is like. So I'm delighted to say at the end of the conference I saw him and the guy had the job. So it was a wonderful testament to see how the show impacts on medical professionals and also how it can be part of trying to create a culture change in many of these institutions. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So there have been conferences and medical training, and in the medical training sessions, individuals lie down in the beds and they experience the show, and then we have a post-show discussion afterwards, which gives them the opportunity to reflect, rare opportunity to reflect as a team and discuss their practice together. This is a photo of me bringing it back to the training wing of the hospital that I was in. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Most recently, this is a shot from me bringing it to medical professionals at Mount Sinai Rehab Hospital in New York City this past September. So I've been receiving wonderful feedback from medical professionals that it gives them the rare opportunity to reflect, and it also gives them a way in which they can resist or work against the culture or demands from their institutions. So lying down in those beds not only reaffirms their humanity, it impacts on their practice and reminds them that we are all one step away from being in those hospital beds ourselves. And it challenges them to consciously consider and take responsibility for the way that they function within the institution, or the way that they function within the dysfunction of their institution. Which is implicit, unfortunately, in the ways that institutions operate. And I say this as a former New York City public school teacher. So institutions incorporate processes and procedures and things that take you perhaps further into efficiency and savings, but further and further away from humanity. Here's what they've said. Next slide, please, Peter.
Okay.
I'll give you a moment to read that for yourselves. I like the arty farty quote, though. And next slide, please.
Yep.
And again, that quote there about a fantastic way of learning really speaks to the power of the arts and the power of that lived experience that the arts can provide. So I'm delighted that almost 10 years on from nearly dying, I've been able to create a show about it that has such a wonderful life, but also is a tool that can help those that work in medical professions not only improve practice daily, but also help create culture change in the institutions. I mean, it's not without the challenges. I'm not in every hospital, and here we have the National Health Service, so there's incredible budgetary and time constraints. But I believe that there's great potential, and that's the feedback that I'm hearing from just regular audiences and medical professionals. So thank you very much for having me and for letting me share. If you're interested in learning more about the show, the website is reassembled.co.uk, and you can see video interviews on there with the creative team and also the medical team, which gives you more information about that 5-year process.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you.
So we haven't discussed who goes next. Do you have a preference? Do you want to do your slide presentation, Kathleen? No? I'm just going to get rid of this. And we're going to go here.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me from here? We're good? Okay. Oops, go to the first page. First of all, it's impossible to sum up the rich history of theatre at William Head and all of the artists that came before me in just 10 minutes. So I'll primarily focus on my own experience of collaboratively creating theatre at William Head in various roles for the past 5 years. William Head on Stage Theatre Society is Canada's longest-running prison theatre company. Established in 1981, it began as part of an initiative that brought university-level courses to residents of federal institutions in BC. Although the prison education programs were short-lived, ending in 1983, the inspiration to create theatre inside of William Head stuck, and the men have produced 56 plays in 36 years. In 1995, William Head on Stage became a BC not-for-profit society operated exclusively by the men inside, and they would have it no other way. Whose gives the men a little bit of freedom, time away from the routine of life inside, and a play is something that they can see through right to the very end. The images in this mini slideshow are compiled by myself, Ingrid Hansen, and Kate Rubin. We've all directed shows at William Head over the past 8 years. You'll notice that most of the faces of the men in these slides are blurred due to confidentiality. William Head Federal Penitentiary is a 45-minute drive from downtown Victoria in a small municipality called Metchosin, BC. This is an overhead shot of William Head. The first play I saw there was Firebugs, directed by Britt Small in 2004. I want to give you an idea of the experience of seeing a Who show if you haven't gone to see one before. First, you have to buy a ticket from a local Victoria vendor. There are no tickets at the door at this event because you cannot exchange cash with the correctional officers. Then you drive through the dark and winding roads, often in October rainstorms, finally arriving at William Head. Leaving everything in your car but your keys and your ID, you enter the gates in single file lines where you are scanned and sniffed by a dog. If the dog sits, you don't get to go see the play. Once inside, you are shuttled to the prison gymnasium in a minivan. You are then filed through a corridor where on the walls are years and years of collaged and framed show photographs and the smell of fresh coffee. The corridor opens into a gymnasium that has been divided by curtains. There are cookies for snacks and a display of arts and crafts for sale, carved and sewn by the residents of William Head. Just beyond the curtain is a stage where the men have been preparing for months, memorizing lines, learning choreography, painting sets, sewing costumes, and hanging lights. You sit on a purple plastic chair, and the correctional officers are standing at every exit and entrance to make sure everything is going smoothly. And then the show begins. Although the residents of William Head have written and produced original plays over the years, whose productions have largely been published classics, I actually was just reading an article from a 2005 Out of Bounds magazine that was advocating for a spring one-act show festival of new work written by the men. And this was around the time that Who's was transitioning from a medium security to a minimum security prison, and all of the spring performances had been canceled. So there's a lot of creativity going on inside there. These photos are from more recent years. We have Animal Farm, written by Chelsea Haberlin, or not written. We have Animal Farm, directed by Chelsea Haberlin from It's a Zoo. The Elephant Man, Waiting for Godot, Gorman Gast, and Macbeth, all directed by Ian Case. And this year's Antigone, which was a return to text, directed by Eliza Gardner. I've seen quite a few Who shows over the years, and I've seen the benefits of this work. The most important part of Who's is the community that grows from working together towards a common goal, painting sets, decorating costumes, hanging lights, designing the program. They do it all. Community is the foundation of Who's, whether the men are making something new or staging a classic. In 2012, longtime Who's collaborator and performer Kate Rubin directed her adaptation of The Hobbit. This successful performance sparked an interest with the men, and they started to discuss the possibilities of more adaptation. In 2015, they approached her again, this time with their own book in mind. Time Waits for No One was a loose adaptation of the book The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom, and this is where I started working with Who's. Kate invited me to join the artistic team of Time Waits for No One as a facilitator and performer. I'd been casually participating in Who's workshops over the winter, and now is time to see how I fit with this growing web of artists and facilitators that we've started to call the Prison Arts Collective. And these are all of the men and women that I've worked with over the years. Basically, all of these people have participated in 2 or more productions at William Head. I want to rewind a little bit and talk about the specific in production that inspired me to work with Who's. I'd known about the program for years and had many friends and colleagues directing and performing shows. But in 2010, Ingrid Hansen, another longtime Who's collaborator and co-artistic director of SNAFU, approached the men about creating one of her signature nonverbal movement-based performances. This was around the same time that we began our SNAFU partnership, creating Little Orange Man in her basement in the day while we trekked out to William Head in the evening. Chalk was the first performance at William Head that I was aware of that collectively devised with stories told directly from the lives of the male cast. I would say it was the first Who show that I attended where I could really hear the men's voices, but of course the piece was nonverbal. More conservative audiences didn't quite know what to do with Chalk, and many had a really visceral response to seeing the stories of men played on stage. The show itself left me speechless, and Ingrid and I still talk about trying to take the show on the road when all of the men get out. In 2013, Ingrid collaborated with Pete Balkwill of the Old Trout Puppet Workshop on Fractured Fables, the prison puppet project. In this performance, the men crafted a series of beautiful puppets while writing monologues from their own personal experience. Ingrid then passed each monologue to a different performer so that the men ended up witnessing their own stories being played back to themselves by their fellow actors. In 2015, Kate Rubin and members of the Prison Arts Collective again collaborated with the men to devise Here, A Captive Odyssey. I took on research, script development, projection designs, and worked as a mentor performer. With a devising process that began in April of 2016, we scoured the records to unearth the history of the land that William Head is on. We staged a time-traveling adventure that paid tribute to all of the people that came before when William Head, the landmass itself, was an indigenous fishing ground, a sheep farm, a quarantine station, and an internment camp for Chinese laborers long before it was a prison. We could have written a million plays on the history of that space, but we also wanted to show our audiences more about the daily life of the men inside of William Head. So we spent a good deal of time encouraging the men to write about their day-to-day, and the present portion of the play was basically a snapshot of the men's experiences. By 2016, I felt skilled enough as a director, teacher, and administrator to manage all of the big personalities at William Head and navigate all of the bureaucratic procedures that a director has to be on top of when directing out there. I was ready to approach the WHO's board of directors to devise Sleeping Giants. With 2 productions under my belt, I'd seen a tremendous amount of raw talent and also professional level skills in writing, hip-hop, indigenous singing, and I also learned that there were men who were skilled as stilt walkers, DJs, clowns, all from their previous lives before entering William Head. I really wanted our audiences to see that every single man who had a desire to perform on the WHO stage was a sleeping giant, ready to wake up and shake the world with their gifts. We used 2 myths as a starting point for the story. Sleeping Beauty, with a focus on the gifts that the fairies bring Sleeping Beauty at the beginning of the story, and Rip Van Winkle, a story about waking up after a long, long time and the whole world's changed around you. We created our own myth about a land called Shinyville, where everybody's been consumed by the blue light, and then the dwellers and the basically people who are affected by this consumption. Around this time, they also stopped letting us take pictures of the shows out of the prison. So these photos are more snapshots of the process. For years, the most enlightening time at William Head has always been in the off-season, when artists are invited to facilitate workshops on a variety of topics, including music, dance, design, and writing. These skills-building workshops have contributed to creating more professional company by developing a language for creation, unlocking hidden creative potential, building a community based in respect, and helping the WHO's board of directors to meet professional artists in the community that can become allies in the future. I really took advantage of the workshops, and in the winter of 2015 and the spring of 2016, I went out every Tuesday to investigate what stories the men really wanted to tell. I would go out with fellow artists to conduct workshops in writing, movement, viewpoints, clown, improvisation, playback theater, and sometimes we would just laugh. And when we're talking about institutional spaces, I also wanted the picture on the far side is a picture of the prison gymnasium. So that's what it looks like before we kind of put a play in there, and it's where we do a lot of our workshops. And then at the end of this slideshow, you'll see how we transform the gymnasium every single time we put on a play. Here it is. This is the prison gymnasium after we put on a play. Finally, I am sure that WHO's would not have gone on for 36 years without the exchange of energy between the men and their audiences. We're so grateful for the William Head administration for the massive job they do every fall. There's no other prison in Canada, and very few in North America, that are brave enough to process 200 people, welcome them into their gates in the dark, usually in the rain and wind, to sit and watch men perform for 2 hours, and then make sure all the audiences leave again. One of the most rewarding parts of the experience for myself and for the men and for the audiences is the talk-back session at the end of the evening. The other picture is me facilitating a talk-back session with the audience after a show. Audiences get a chance to ask questions, make comments, and the men get a chance to answer with honest and heartfelt responses. And I'll just read out this quote from an audience member. I admire your courage for including aspects of your own present experience at William Head, which you did with artistic taste and human dignity. Please know that your work is a positive cultural contribution to our community, just as worthwhile for people on the outside reaching in, as I understand it is for people on the inside reaching out. Thank you. Should I escape this? leave it up. Okay.
Gina or Eric, you can also, those mics are loud if you prefer to sit there.
Yeah, okay, doesn't matter. Whichever would be better for...
We just need the sound for the recording.
Okay.
It's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Is this thing on? Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Patrick Keating. I'm not as organized as Kathleen, so I don't have anything really prepared. I'll just talk about my experience is from the other side. I spent about 10 years inside penitentiaries and came to theater there. The first play that I ever saw was inside Askew. At that time, University of Victoria was giving university courses, and one of the courses that I took was a theater course. And the only reason really why I signed up for it was because a lot of the other guys wanted it. And so, I mean, I didn't know theater. I'd never been to a play, anything. And so a lot of them wanted it, so I signed on. Right? And through just working with the teacher, Richard Payne, became to be more interested and curious about the theater. And when we did the play, it was Ubu Roi. It was a clown piece. And a theater company came up, and it was Tamanous Theater. And they reciprocated by bringing up a play by Samuel Beckett, Happy Days, that they were producing at the time. And that's the first play that I had ever seen. And it affected me not only because of the performance of the actress, Ronnie Gilbert, but the content of the play. The first act, the woman is up to her waist in sand, and the second act is up to her neck in sand. And her day begins and ends with a bell. And I thought that this is my life. And so it got me interested in pursuing, theater. The two tech people that were in charge of the set and the costumes, Barbara Clayton and Philip Tidd, they told the guys, including myself, that if we wanted to push in the right direction, we should give them a call when we got out. And so I got out about a couple of months later and gave them a call. And they welcomed me in. I sort of became a sponge. I went down, they invited me into the rehearsal hall. I sat in the corner and just watched and did whatever they needed to be done, painting chairs or doing whatever. Theater didn't save me at that moment because I ended up going back inside for another 6 years. And then when I got out then, Simon Fraser was giving courses, and I enrolled in Simon Fraser out when I got out, and I was in the halfway house. And I went through the theater department and got my BA, majoring in theater, and then just started working. I mean, I don't really know what to say. It's I've wrote this play that I'm doing now to try and give back a little bit. I guess a couple of things dovetailed at the time. I was always very shy or reticent to share my story because I was worried that I would be either ostracized from the community or people would take offense to it. So I didn't really tell people, except people that were very close to me. And then a few years ago, I guess about 5 years ago, the association, the Actors Association, Equity, sends a newsletter around. And there was a notice of a memorial for the teacher that came in and taught us at Matsqui, Richard Payne. And so I started thinking about how much he gave me. So I thought, I should maybe give back. And started to think about producing and doing something that would share my experience. And at the time, I was working with a group of, with a theater company called Main Street Theater. And it was a group of young guys. They were in their 30s, and I'm much older. So I was like the the idiot uncle, right? And I would go out with them, and we would, we'd have a coffee or a beer, and they would start telling stories, and then I would pipe up with some story, and they'd go, dude, you got to write this stuff down, right? And to me, I mean, it's my life, so it's boring, I mean, I've been through it, right? So it wasn't a big deal. But they said, okay, look, we'll have a fundraiser. You write, some stories down, and we'll see what happens. And so we did it at Little Mountain Gallery, and we crammed about 70 people into the venue, and got a lot of encouragement from different artists that I admired, Gina being one of them, and so we started from there. Last summer, I guess the first time I performed it was about 2 years ago, and last summer I was invited to Victoria at the Uno Festival. It's a festival of one-person shows. And while I was there, Kate Rubin, who works at the William Head, asked me if I would want to go up and perform the piece inside. And so right away I said, yeah, I'd love to. Right? And so we went up and we did it in the Salmon House, which I was quite honored to, be allowed into that space. And I was fighting with the playoffs were on. So I was fighting against that. It was a big challenge, right? But about 30, 40 guys came. And I wasn't really sure how they were taking it, because they were very respectful. So they just sat and they were listening, and then I'd hear a couple of chuckles in the back, and I go, oh, okay, they're on board here. And there was one guy in front, and he was a large man. He was probably about 6'3", bald head, and about 230. Stand up. Stand up?
Yes, stand up.
Oh, he was bigger than me. And his arms were like the size of my thighs, which isn't saying a lot, but, they were big. And he just sat there through the whole thing, just staring at me. And I thought, oh, okay, I wonder how he's taking this. And when we finished, he stood up, and he was the first one in line to shake my hand. And my hand went into his, like a little baby's hand, into his hand. And he started talking, and he said, he started welling up. And he said, I've always tried to find the words, and I could never do it. You did. Yeah. That's me.
I'm 73, and so when you reach the ripe old age of 73, you have many, many memories. You start to spend a lot of time in the past and trying to kind of make sense about, did you do it all right? Have you made things better or worse in the world? And all those kind of very deep existential philosophical things. I will tell you that probably of all the things that I've done in my long and varied career with theatre at the Wellspring, the time that I spent, first of all, in Askew prison, at the end of my 4 years at SFU, 3 women, myself and Patty Allen, who many of you will know, and my dear colleague Melanie Doerr, were asked would we go into Askew because the guys wanted to remount a production of Lone Star, and they needed directors. So we just finished semester. Away I go to Askew, not on the day that they went because I had an exam or something for my English major that day. So I went up on my own into Askew for orientation. And when I left Askew that day to drive home, I was shaking with anger all the way back to SFU. And why was I so angry? But I remember that day and that drive back so vividly because I'd just spent 4 years in an institution. And let's not kid ourselves. Universities are very large, very powerful, very structured institutions. Even SFU, which came to my attention when I lived in Montreal, and this new radical university was opening. And the students were taking over the university, and eventually, several years later, when I went back to university after my children went to school, it was a business school, pretty much. But the theatre program and the Centre for the Arts were cutting edge, and they ran an interdisciplinary program. And a lot of the people who've started new companies in this city, and the person who's ahead of the PuSh festival, we all had our awakening, if you like, at SFU. But I was angry when I drove home back to SFU that day because what I'd witnessed were people lining up to get drugs at the dispensary. And what I'd just learned is that most of the guys that were there because they had addiction problems. They may have robbed banks or they may have done all kinds of other things, but basically they were incarcerated in this institution because of an addiction problem. And to see them lining up to get drugs somehow struck me as a divide of hypocrisy somehow. I can't take it, just hit me like that. Anyway, I went in and I worked with 3 men, and my 2 female colleagues worked with 2 other women and one of the inmates who was going through transgender. And they worked one side of a divide, and I worked on the other side. And I learned more in that month, going in every day to work in the prison, than I'd learned the previous 4 years at SFU, without a doubt. Without a doubt. When the show was performed and people lined up to come in and had their security clearance and were accepted as members to see the performance, after the first show, I've never seen such excitement from a group of actors in my life at the sense of accomplishment that they had. Quite rightly, they had a sense of accomplishment. And I drove home that night with my husband, who never really could be bothered to come and see any of my work, who never really ever said anything much about my work, said, in his taciturn way, that was worth the effort. That's true. That's what he said. It was, for him, the most important thing I'd ever done, and I realized, in a way, it kind of was the most important thing that I felt that I'd ever done. As a result of that, I got a phone call from the fellow who was responsible for the prison ed program that was run by SFU at that time, and he said he'd seen the show and he wanted me to go in and teach an acting class for credit at Kent Maximum Security Prison. I was about to leave the country. It was 1986. I was running away from Expo, taking my children around Scotland. And I said, I can't really talk to you right now. I'm just about to go on a plane. And he said, no, you have to give me an answer because I have to put the funding together. And I said, give me a day to think about it. So he phoned me back, and I said, well, if I do it, I would want this, I wouldn't want that, all kinds of things that I thought he would say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. Much to my surprise, he said, sure, you got it. Have a good trip. So I drove out to Kent 1 day a week and spent the whole day there because one of my conditions was I wasn't going to go back 2 days because it's out at Agassiz. It's a long way away, out of the city. And basically, I had insisted that I didn't want guards in the room. If I was going to teach an acting class, I didn't want men with guns standing in the corner. So they were outside the room. And I, within all of my innocence, and I say this truly humbly, in all of my innocence, I taught that acting class as if I was teaching it anywhere else. I asked the guys to do all kinds of trust exercises. If I could get somebody to move away from the wall and come into the center of the room, I knew that they'd got an A. You know, anybody who's ever been in any kind of place like a prison, trust is a huge thing. It's all about keeping your back turned away and making sure nobody's after you. And I decided that I would cooperate with the people who were taking an English class for credit, and they were doing Shakespeare plays. And so basically I assigned the guys things to work on that were from the plays that they were studying. And my most vivid recollection is of somebody who was doing the speech, the Lear speech on the moor. And he said the day that he was going to make his presentation to class, okay, I've got a fan. And he had one of the guys throw water at the fan so that he could do blow winds. But it was magnificent. It was magnificent to see that even in a small way, to see that the power that theatre can have to help people come to grips with their own condition, how their own condition and place in the world fits into the grander scheme of things. I think it gives people perspective. I think it gives people a framework of how to look at the world in perhaps a different way. And that one of the things that I believe about live theatre is that if it's good, it doesn't matter how humble it is or how grand it is, if it connects, if we suspend our disbelief while we're in that shared space, it never leaves us. It becomes part of us. And I believe we are the stories we tell. And this fellow here, I met when he came out of Matsqui and was a student at SFU. By then I was kind of teaching classes up there and sometimes directing shows. He became my colleague on stage in a production of The Tempest. I cast him in a play at SFU that I was directing. And one night, I don't know if he remembers this, but we were in the audience of some kind of, I don't know, where it was a play, an opening night. And I hadn't seen him for a while. And I said, what have you been doing? And he said, what have I been doing? Oh, well, I went to a workshop about the business. And I said, what did you learn? And he said, I learned I have to make my own work. And I have to ask people if I want them to work with me. I said, that's a good thing to learn. And he said, yeah, actually, I've always really wanted to work with you. And I said, okay, what do you want to do? Really? He said, just like that? I said, yeah, just like that. And then we had a very long association and friendship. And he would walk and talk and tell me the stories of him being in prison. Before he told the guys that he got friendly with at Little Mountain. We walked and talked around Britannia Field, and he would tell me the stories of his prison life. And I realized that I was being made privy to something that was rather special. And I said, you have to write this stuff down. This is your work. And eventually, he did it, and he does it magnificently. And if you haven't seen it, I urge you to go and see it, because it's the most relevant thing that he can do to give back, is to share that intensely personal story and to give us some kind of an understanding through the structure he's chosen. And that was his biggest, I know because he would tell me, I don't know, no, I've got this sound in my head. I know sound is going to make an important, and that's exactly what he's incorporated all these years later. So, institutions, theatre, whether I was using theatre in classes to bring stuff to life for the students to learn by doing, whether I ended up at some point teaching in a prison, directing in a prison, or whether I decided to do theatre in people's living rooms because I was so fed up with trying to fill out grants to get money to get a theatre to do it. And I realized that people were seeing me in their living rooms and they may never have seen live performance before. And I knew that it was relevant. It was relevant. It was intimate and it was relevant. And that's what theatre is. Very intimate and incredibly relevant. Thank you.
This is the portion of the conversation where we have a conversation. Shannon, are you back? There we are. Great. So we're just going to open things up. If you have a question, I'll bring the mic to you and pose it to, it could be a general question for the entire panel or a specific question to one of the presenters. Let me know if anybody has a question. Yep.
Thank you. Really a question for the whole panel. I guess I'm wondering, you talk a lot about the process and the type of work that you can do in the institutional settings you have. I'm curious about what is the work that you do to get into institutions in the first place so you can do that kind of work? What is that process? What are the challenges? What is unique about that as opposed to getting into more arts type organizations and getting through those doors so you can do work in a hospital or in a prison or in whatever other places you do your work in?
Hello. We actually have this conversation quite often at William Head, that we just had a symposium because suddenly prison theatre has become a really hot topic, and we had a symposium inside the prison where a lot of people are really excited about getting into prisons and doing theatre because suddenly it's kind of booming. And my experience is that for years I had friends going in and directing plays, and I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I wasn't ready to kind of represent myself and to, what's the word? That I didn't have anything to offer yet, essentially, as a facilitator. And so when I was finally ready, at William Head you have to become a prison volunteer. So I went through an orientation process and became a volunteer, and then started doing workshops with people who are already out there doing workshops, and basically just actively participated as a great example an awesome participant, kind of for the men, because it takes a lot to get them to trust. So having me running around being kind of dorky and doing things, it helped them. So my first experience working in a prison was actually just being an exemplary volunteer, and for the people who were facilitating workshops, kind of helping them by being an example. And then through that process, I've built really solid relationships with the people that are working out at William Head right now. And we have just continued to create work together. They're kind of my soul artists, the artists that I love to work with. So for me, it evolved quite naturally. But it is very difficult to just step into a prison and say, I am going to teach you theater, because I feel like you have to get to know the people that you're working with. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I would think it's quite hard if you want to get into a prison. Rob a bank. Yeah. But it's quite difficult unless they have an education system already in place. Then you could contact them and maybe try and twist their arm, or entice them into letting you come in, but it's very rare. Most of the education programs have been cut from the federal institutions. When I was inside, it was quite a while ago, and so all those things are gone now. And really, the only theater group that I think there's one in Ontario, and there's William Head, and that's about it.
And I'm just going to add really quickly, both of those are not programs, so they're entirely volunteer-based. Mm-hmm. So we apply and receive funding for the performances, but everything else that we do, all of the administrative work that I do and everything like that, is volunteer, which is hard for an artist who needs to make a living to do.
Shannon, do you have anything to add, Shannon, about processes of entering into hospital or medical care facilities, and how that might differ from, your process differ from, say, art therapy programs or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I would echo what the other panelists were saying it's about relationships and building the relationships. Obviously, I hope none of you need a consultant neurosurgeon or head injury nurse with which you then have a long-term relationship with after leaving their care. But still, with that, and also the way I should say I got into Mount Sinai, is that it was through an OT who I knew through a friend, and she experienced a 10-minute sample lying on her living room floor. They lived in the same apartment building. But all that being said, especially the medical institutions, they are incredibly difficult to get into, because people's time, even more than money, is when you're asking someone to give up their time, 20 minutes, 45 minutes, it's nearly impossible. So even though this is a high-quality piece that has a lot of impact and meaning behind it, I'm still finding loads of challenges to navigate the maze to access medical professionals to get them into my beds.
Other questions? Heman has the microphone as well, and we still have one at the back. Heather. Oh, there's one.
Hi, thank you for all of your wonderful stories. I was curious a bit, Kathleen, you were talking about doing Macbeth and different stories, and then they kind of got more and more devised, and I was curious if all three of you or anybody could talk about the difference between bringing in an existing work or devising from personal stories with the inmates or whoever in these community settings.
I'll just say that I forgot to tell you that I did take a production of a play called Self-Accusation. It's a Peter Handke piece. that I directed and it ended up being at the part of the first ever Fringe Festival. And Norman Armour performed in it. And we did it at the first Fringe Festival accidentally because we couldn't do it the way we were going to do it. And then we did it at a pub on Kingsway. And then because I had some kind of little bit of an association with the prisons, I asked if we could take it into Kent Maximum and Matsqui Prison, and we did finally get permission to do that. Self-accusation, for those of you that you don't know the piece, it's a kind of an anti-theatre piece. It's kind of breaking down traditional theatre, and it starts out with I was born, and it's a litany of all of the ways you transgress. I don't think I'm exaggerating if I tell you that it had its best reception in the prisons. They understood things in a much different way than any other audience would. And they were laughing and chuckling about things that never occurred to me that they were that funny. And we took the piece with another self-written piece by my colleague Melanie, and she had written a one-woman show about being raped when she was traveling in Central America. And those two pieces we did at Kent and at Matsqui. And whether it was the self-accusation piece that was already a scripted, written piece, or whether it was a piece that had been developed by the theatre artist, both of those pieces really connected with the guys. If they wandered into the room to watch what was going on, they certainly didn't wander out. But we weren't up against the hockey finals. I don't think it matters. I really don't think it matters as a short answer. I can never give a short answer. I don't think it matters whether it's something that you've rehearsed and taken in that's already been written by a dramatist, or whether it's a piece that you have personally developed and you're taking it in. The knack is to talk your way into going in to perform it for them. And if you can do that, you never know who might get turned on in there, and it may start the recovery of their life after prison.
What I've been doing for the past 5 years is devising with the men inside of prison. So more physically creating our own pieces to be performed inside. And I hope one day we'll be able to take one out too. For a long time, William Head on Stage was able to take plays that they were working on out into the community and perform at the McPherson Playhouse, but using like an ETA program, basically. But that got cut as well. But I see the big difference is that the guys really want to tell their stories, I guess. Still the same amount of work goes into creating an already written piece and a new piece. Actually, that's a lie. The same amount of work from the Who's board goes into creating the pieces. So all of the design and building sets, all of that kind of stuff. It's still an amazing community building experiences where all the guys team up, create a community, and work hard until the very end. But devising, which is my specific field of interest, it's quite a bit of work for the artists coming in, because you're facilitating and managing, making sure that basically everybody's voices are heard in a devising process. But the result, I guess, the relationship with the audience becomes more rich only in the experience that I've had seeing plays and being part of an audience, watching plays and participating in talkbacks as an audience, versus participating in talkbacks with collaboratively created pieces. The audience there's more of an electric connection between the audience and the performers, because the performers are saying, I created this is mine, I own it, And the audience are just so excited to have directly received stories from the men. So there's an electric buzz that kind of exists when we've collaboratively created. But it is a huge process to do something like that. And you're right, just as valuable of a process to be creating plays that are already written.
I actually wouldn't mind asking Shannon and Patrick. I'm curious because your works that are on at the PuSh Festival, and I do encourage you all to go see both of them, bring the institution into the theater. The experience of being in the hospital, the experience of being in the prison, and not curiously, but interestingly, both use sound in very key ways. That's the raison d'être of your piece, Shannon, but also there are these key moments of the doors clanging, Patrick. So just in terms of the development of both of your projects, could you each speak to the degree to which you were sensitive or aware of or conscious of the need to convey that sensory experience of the institution to your theater audience?
For me,
Patrick,
knew.
Could you use the mic?
For me, I knew that the main sound that I wanted to get across was the doors, just the slamming of those big steel doors, because it's quite jarring, and it's something that stays with me, even though I've been out for almost 30 years. So I knew that I wanted to have that as part of the piece, and that's the main sound that I wanted to capture. Yeah.
Shannon, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I think sound was such a big thing for me in terms of realizing how my world had changed. The fact that my ears now felt that they were constantly being assaulted, that they were exhausted, like my ear canals were on fire. So it was a major way in which I felt my world had changed, and therefore, if I was recreating this world to audience members, that was a major element of that. I think there was a lot in the hospital beds, I found, and the act of audiences getting their medical wristband and being greeted by a nurse, and slowly, step by step, having their agency started to be taken away from them in this medical performance, in a way that was safe, but also really conveyed the major elements for me and what it was like to all of a sudden wake up and not be able to walk, not know when I was going to be able to get out, not have control of my food, not have if 9 weeks as an inpatient, you get institutionalized pretty quickly. I remember the first day I was on day release, they kind of all joked about it. It was a freezing windy day in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I think it was, late January. And my partner was delighted because she was like, great, we get to take her outside. We get to get her not only off the ward, but we get to get her outside. And I walked out the door, a big cold Irish wind blew. I screamed and ran back inside. I was like, I'm not going back out there. I felt very quickly that there was something about the hospital environment that very quickly removed my agency, and through small steps within the show, I started to recreate that for the audience. They are required to take their shoes off. They don't know what necessarily they're going to expect, because lots of times people haven't experienced binaural microphone technology and what that does. They are told to lay down. The nurse places the equipment on them. The nurse places the blindfolds on and the eye masks and the earphones on them. But slowly through that, you start to surrender and sink into being immersed in the piece, which is also a sense of, at times it's terrifying, but also I'm hearing back it's blissful. It's like floating. It's kind of being in a dream in a way. So I tell people a lot that it's a story of terror and discovery and humor, but above all, hope, despite being, in a hospital bed.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the fact that we're in a capitalist society, and it seems to me like this is our prison. What is the theatre doing about that, or do we have to rely on politics for our salvation?
Geez, I don't have an answer to that one. I don't know how theater is going to get out of that. Politics probably help, I would think.
Kathleen, go for it.
One of the really exciting inspirations for Sleeping Giants when I was working on it was one of the guys was telling me a story about taking the ferry over he had a short release to go over for a family emergency, and he took the ferry over, and he'd been in for like 8 years or something like that at the time, and he was allowed to sit with his escort on the ferry, and it was the first time he'd really been out in public since for 8 years, and he was kind of trying to make eye contact with people and engage with people in some way because he was free, and everybody was focused right in on their devices, so they're on their cell phones, on their tablets, on their computers, everything like that, and that was kind of the beginning of the story of Sleeping Giants. Is all of the guys that had been in for a really long time, because William Head's a minimum security, so it's a release facility. So a lot of the guys had been in anywhere from 10 years to 25 years, some of them only 4 or 5 years, but the huge transition that happened in that time it's really shocking, I guess, to a lot of the guys being released now, because this society we live in, everybody's glued, nobody connects anymore, and I feel it's a result of our capitalist society. So with Sleeping Giants, they were exploring those experiences.
Kathleen Flaherty, you had your hand up. Could we get a microphone to Kathleen?
Oh, right. Okay. Shannon, you talked about creating change, cultural change in the institution by doing what you were doing, and I wondered if you would talk a little more about what you mean by that, and I'm wondering if the other panelists had similar experiences.
I think what I'm referring to is what I was hearing back a lot around professional camaraderie, professional support. For example, Mount Sinai, that was the first time that some of the staff had ever met each other, let alone had a chance to kind of discuss freely what impact the show had on them, and they crossed ranks and hierarchy in those groups. So you had your personal care assistants alongside the consultant, the consultant doctor, for example, that would be on the floor. So we were demanding that people knew each other as individuals first by their first names, not by their rank, and so forth, as a way to kind of connect with each other as humans, as individuals, and then also via the piece as a discussion point. And what Andrea, the OT who brought me in, who also has a history of being a professional dancer, so she was already sold on the power of the arts, which is very rare. She was meeting with the board of trustees and the management about how using Reassembled could help them basically try and free up more time to get support, to look at how, because they work in such a traumatic environment, they're supporting individuals who are learning how to walk again, who may never walk again, lots of young men, lots of stroke victims. It's a very upsetting situation to be in. I know from being on the acute neuro ward for just 9 weeks how harrowing it is, and I'm very lucky. Most people don't end up as well as I have, and just how difficult it is as professionals, as humans, to kind of, you have to separate your emotions or else you can't function. But at the same time, what does that mean? What impact does that have on your ability to connect and hear the humanity of your patients who are experiencing this trauma in their lives for the first time, whereas you might know through your experience of being there, seeing similar things for 5 or 10 years, that the trajectory commonly is positive or it might not be. So they were saying back to me, especially the Mount Sinai staff, because that was most recent, that they wanted it back. They believed everybody in the whole entire staff, the institution of Mount Sinai, of which there's all these different branches, and autism school and everything, believed should experience it. So then they had this common reference point. And this, even though it was an individual experience, it was a shared experience, and kind of in that they all came out of it at the same time. They got to reflect together at the same time, have that discussion. And it resonated with them for days. There were people that, I was there for a total of 2 weeks, and there were people that I saw at the end of the 2 weeks that were coming up to me and saying, I'm still thinking about this show. That phrase that's in your show, I heard myself saying it to, that was me, that I would say it to my patients or the people that I'm doing physio with, and I didn't realize the negative impact that it has, and now I'm using a different phrase. So kind of small, tangible change on a daily level in their practice, but then also looking at how that can translate to policy change, how that can translate to service design. Another final example is they were talking about, I had no idea the ward was so loud, and it made me really aware of how noisy everything is in our building, like the security codes, everything, to get in and out of somewhere, you're beeping and the doors are slamming, and it wasn't until I was lying down on this bed being surrounded by all this sound that I had no control over, that I found so overwhelming, that I kind of then used that perspective, brought it back into my day, and went, actually, this is not okay. Let's therefore do something about it to change it. I hope that, it's almost midnight here, so I hope that answers your question. I don't know.
No, it's very articulate. Thanks. Very quickly, do any of the other panelists want to address this idea of change, and maybe at the level of institutional operations even, or policy, that some of the work you've done, whether you see that or what?
I see change all the time, especially having participated for a longer period of time now. Like, the men that I work with continue to grow and express, and so there's that obvious change there. And the institution is starting to understand theater more. They've since in the time that I've been there, they've actually hired a specific programs officer to be the facilitator between the artists and the board of directors. So there's change happening. They're starting to believe that theater is can transform people, and the network of prison artists really internationally is starting to connect. So that I see a lot of change there. The fact that we can engage with other artists and talk about our experiences. So.
Gina, I don't know. Did you have a comment?
The only thing that I would add to it is at the end of teaching a first semester at Kent, I wrote a letter and left on the desk of the person who'd hired me to do it, with my observations of my work there and the experience for me. And my overwhelming sense, is that the people who work at the prison are just as much inmates as the people who've been incarcerated in there. And the notion of them and us, which is very much our daily life in every aspect, them and us, it's the other. That's why we can have people who can create wars, because we have to have an other who's different and dangerous and an enemy or whatever, right? In the prison, I really noticed the them and us notion. From the minute that you go in and you have to be cleared through security and you have to leave your toothbrush or whatever you've brought in the locker. I was there one morning and watched a woman who was clearly going to get married that morning. I'd arrived to teach a class, and this person was there going through security, and the guard was ripping apart her bouquet. Later on that night, I saw on the nightly news that was the day Susan Musgrave married Bill. You may or may not know of that association. But it was that one, kind of image in your brain. What am I seeing? This lady dressed up with her bouquet being processed through security. And the people would say to me, the guards at the front gate, when I went in at the security clearance, "Oh, you're back again. I don't know why you have to come and teach an acting class. We're all a bunch of bad actors." And that notion of separation is very, very present in the prison system. And I don't know how you overcome that, other than to keep doing it and to invite them to the theatre in the prison, to get them to go to theatre outside of prison, to go into their living rooms and perform. I don't know what you have to do. But what you have to do is we have to stop thinking of them and us. It's we. And it's as simple as that.
I have a little thing to add to that, a funny thing about a correctional officer at the gate. I'm also part of book clubs for inmates, and we go in once a month and we read a book, and last month was The Outsiders, which was a very fun, simple book to read before Christmas. And as we were going through, one of the correctional officers was like, "What are you reading this week?" And usually they do. They're like, "Why are you even coming in here?" They don't know how to read, and it's a really quite a negative experience. But so the play this year was Antigone, and this correctional officer saw that we had The Outsiders, and she's like, "I don't know why you did Antigone this year. It made no sense. I didn't understand what was going on. I don't think the guys understood what was going on. But why don't you do The Outsiders next year?" And she got really excited about getting involved in the play selection process. And I was just like, for the first time in a while, I got a really positive response from a correctional officer, and it was quite exciting.
Well, that's a wonderful positive note on which to end. We're at time. Poor Shannon, it's midnight in Northern Ireland. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, all of you, for your attention. I want to also just acknowledge Colin Williscroft in the corner has been diligently videotaping this. We are committed to archiving all of these talks, and on the IPS YouTube site, you will in a few weeks be able to go and use this potentially in some institutional setting. in whatever manner you might choose. Thank you again. A reminder, we'll be back here same time next week with Object-Oriented Performance Practices panel, and then the following Friday in the morning in the cinema for Contemporary Indigenous Women's Performance. Enjoy the festival. Patrick's play is on tonight at Performance Works. Shannon's piece continues through next week, and there's so much more to see. So thanks to our panelists, and thank you, all of you.